Hi, welcome back to the channel. In today's episode, I want to talk about the latest data coming out of Russia because honestly, the numbers are telling a really strange and contradictory story right now. And for those of you who've been missing my charts recently, don't worry because today we've got quite a few of them. But before we get into the details, could I ask anybody that hasn't subscribed yet to please hit that subscriber button? It really does help me with the algorithm, also puts a smile on my face. Now, when you first look at the headline inflation chart for Russia, which is this one alongside me here, things actually look to be improving. So if we look at the annual inflation rate, the latest data for April shows that year-on-year inflation increased by 5.6%, which is actually an improvement against the 5.8% in March. So inflation is still significantly above the Russian central bank's official 4% target, but the direction of travel, the trend here, at least on the surface, appears to be improving slightly. It's still significantly above 4%, but it's lower than it was last month. If we then have a look at the month-on-month inflation chart, which basically shows how much inflation has changed in the month rather than just over the last 12 months, things look even calmer. Prices increased by just 0.1% during April. So once again here, the trend appears to be moving in the right direction from Russia's perspective. And if you're sitting there looking purely at those first two charts, you could easily conclude that Russia is finally starting to get inflation under control. Now, in fairness, there is a logical explanation for why inflation might be easing slightly. The Russian central bank currently has interest rates sitting at 14.5%, which is an extraordinarily high level. That means borrowing is expensive in Russia, mortgages are expensive in Russia, business loans are expensive in Russia, and when interest rates are pushed that high, the whole purpose is to slow the economy down, weaken demand, reduce spending, and eventually bring inflation under control. So on the surface, the policy appears to be having some effect. But this is where things start to become slightly strange because although inflation is supposedly cooling, the Russian economy itself is still clearly under severe pressure. Economic growth is slowing, consumers are under pressure, businesses are under pressure, sanctions continue to disrupt trade and supply chains. And it's actually quite unusual to have interest rates at 14.5% when headline inflation is supposedly only 5.6%. The two of those really don't balance up. Normally, if inflation was genuinely stabilizing at those sort of levels, you'd expect interest rates to be much lower than that, potentially around about the same level. So the fact that the central bank still feels the need to keep rates this high suggests policymakers themselves may not fully trust that inflation is genuinely under control yet. And that brings us on to the next chart, food inflation. Now, we always like to look at food inflation because the poorest members of society are impacted more when food prices rise. And at first glance, this chart actually looks relatively stable. Food inflation is currently running around 4% year on year, which is broadly in line with the central bank's target. And importantly, that's slightly lower than the previous month as well. So once again, if we're just looking at the headline figures here, the picture appears to be improving. Now, politically, this matters enormously for the Kremlin because food prices directly affect ordinary citizens every single day. When food inflation spikes, public frustration rises very quickly, so stable food inflation is extremely important. But then we move on to the producer price chart, and this is where the whole story suddenly becomes really peculiar because producer prices, or factory gate prices, the price of a good when it's leaving the production in Russia, are telling a completely different story. Now, just to explain this chart, producer prices are effectively the prices charged by factories, manufacturers, industrial firms, food producers, and companies producing goods before those goods reach consumers. So these are the prices inside Russian production system itself. And normally, producer prices feed through into consumer inflation. If producers face rising costs, eventually wholesalers pay more, retailers pay more, and ultimately consumers pay more, which is why the latest data is so strange because producer prices increased by 5.5% year on year in April. Now that itself is a remarkable number because in each of the previous 5 months, producer prices had actually been falling year on year. And in March specifically, producer prices were down by 1.8%. So Russian producers were effectively selling goods at prices 1.8% lower than they had been the previous year. But suddenly, 1 month later, we swing from minus 1.8% to plus 5.5%. That's a swing of more than 7% in a single month. Now, that is an enormous change. Then if we look at the monthly producer price chart, producer prices jumped by 6.1% in April alone. So the obvious question here is, what on earth is going on? Because these producer price numbers are pointing in the complete opposite direction to the consumer inflation data. Consumer inflation says pressure is easing. Producer prices say pressure is suddenly surging. And those two stories really don't fit together comfortably. Now, one explanation is that Russian producers are exporting a large proportion of their output, which means that they may be benefiting from higher export pricing while domestic inflation remains relatively contained. But that explanation also raises problems because Russia is still heavily sanctioned. Trade routes are more expensive, logistics are more expensive, financing is more expensive. So many exports are being sold at discounted prices compared with global benchmarks. So it's difficult to fully explain such a dramatic producer price swing purely through exports. Another possibility is that costs inside the Russian economy are now rising very rapidly, but those costs have not yet fully filtered through into consumer prices. And that raises another really important question. If Russia has increasingly become dependent on domestic production because sanctions have reduced imports, then why hasn't consumer inflation risen much more sharply already? Because logically, if domestic producers are facing significantly higher costs, you would normally expect that to show up very quickly in inflation, particularly when the economy is already under pressure from labour shortages, sanctions, supply chain disruption, and high financing costs. So either Russian businesses are absorbing these costs and taking a major hit to profitability, or the consumer inflation numbers are lagging behind and the inflationary pressure simply hasn't reached ordinary consumers yet. And if that's the case, then these producer price figures may actually be acting as an early warning signal for future inflation problems. Then on top of all of this, we also have rising global energy costs linked to the war in Iran. Oil prices have increased, shipping costs have increased, insurance costs have increased, transport and logistical costs have increased. And although Russia exports energy, sanctions means it now operates through far more complicated and expensive trading arrangements than before. So Russian producers are effectively being squeezed from multiple directions simultaneously. And this is why I think the latest data actually paints a much weaker picture of the Russian economy than the headline inflation charts initially suggest. Because underneath the surface, the economy still appears heavily distorted and under significant strain. The central bank clearly remains worried, otherwise interest rates would not be sitting at 14.5%. Businesses are clearly facing rising costs, and the producer price data suggests inflationary pressure may still be building behind the scenes, even though the consumer inflation charts currently look calmer, which creates a major dilemma for the Russian central bank. Because if headline inflation continues falling, there will eventually be pressure to start cutting interest rates to support the economy. But if producer prices are now surging again, cutting rates too early could quickly reignite inflation. And that would leave Russia stuck in an extremely uncomfortable position. So the big question now is this: is inflation genuinely coming under control in Russia, or has the pressure simply moved further back into the supply chain for now? Because if these factory gate price increases continue feeding through into the wider economy over the next few months, then ordinary Russians may not yet have felt the full inflationary impact. And if that happens, Russia could find itself facing another wave of rising prices at exactly the same time that economic growth is already weakening and the wider economy is already under severe pressure. So I'll keep you posted on any further news and developments, but hopefully you found today's video useful, informative, and most importantly, thought-provoking. If you have liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up. Please subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. Don't forget, I'm currently running a competition where you can win my property located close to one of the UK's best beaches or a cash alternative prize. Scan the QR code on the screen now. You basically take a picture with your phone or click the link in the description below if you want to get involved in that. Thank you for everyone that's bought tickets so far. I've got some great deals on the go at the moment because we're coming to a conclusion. They're the best deals I've ever offered. So now's a good time to get involved and buy a ticket. It's a way of funding the channel. Thank you to everyone that's supported me in other ways. If you bought me a coffee, sent me a YouTube super thanks, or signed up as a patron or a member, thank you for that support. Really do appreciate it. Just wanted to mention that Joe Blogs Russia is now live. So if you're watching this video on my main channel and you're only really interested in Russian content, or you just want to go to a place where it's all about Russia, then that's the place for you. There's a link at the end of today's video. We'll take you through to one of the videos. Please go and subscribe, support that channel. Watch some of the videos because I need to build up some watch time to hit all of YouTube's metrics. So thank you if you've done that already. I also wanted to mention that Joe and Naz is live. This is a bit of something a bit different, a bit of light relief. You'll find it entertaining. We're going reviewing food and a few other things. It's fun, it's exciting, it's fun having two of us on screen. You'll see the interchange in the banter between us. I think you're going to like it. There's a link at the end of today's video that will take you through to Joe and Naz, one of our latest videos. Please subscribe, please watch some of the others on the channel. And in the meantime, here's something to put a smile on your face.